Welcome to Survey and Beyond, the data collection podcast by Survey CTO. We share expert insights and practical tips on data collection and analysis, discuss innovative methods and tools to enhance data quality and security, and demystify complex data concepts to help people collecting data all around the world. I'm your host, Marta Costa. Joining us today is Dr. Pashayan, an expert in informal settlements, international development, political science, and international relations. She is an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a visiting professor at American University's Nairobi campus, where she leads research on informal settlements. Her research has been focused on extreme poverty reduction in Nairobi's Mukuru slums and is published in her book, Below the Proletariat, which examines the disconnect between international development programs and the realities of slum dwellers. Today, we will dive into the ethics of field research, unexpected challenges in data collection, and guiding students in fieldwork. Welcome, Dr. Pashayan. So, Dr. Pashayan, your work is highly focused on informal settlements or slums, specifically in Nairobi, Kenya. Can we start by just sharing what drew you to this context, to these fields, and what is the importance of this field?
So yeah, two great starters. What drew me to this field was really just inquisitiveness, curiosity. And with most research, people don't always think about the curiosity. They think about, okay, this needs to be done or that needs to be done. But for me, it's genuine curiosity. Everything about informal settlements, about daily life, about hardship, about how they do find some income to persevere, about resilience from different types of shocks. And that curiosity drew me to my research in informal settlements. Your other point was about the importance of it. It is really important. It's super important, basically, when you think about the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And when you think about some of the conditions that people live in, it's inhumane. And when we think about basics like shelter and water and clean air, people who live in informal settlements lack those three main elements. And those are elements that we need to survive.
And in your book, Below the Proletariat, you are mentioning that there are significant gaps between the international development programs and the needs of slum dwellers. Do you think data collection can play a role in bridging the disconnect between these two? And if so, what role?
I think there's a blend. So there's data collection, which is one thing, right? And getting your work published. But there's more to that, because just because you publish something doesn't mean that people in power who can make change are reading your work. And so while data is extremely important, I believe that blending publications with attending events. For example, I attend the World Bank spring meetings, and I attend the World Bank annual meetings and the IMF Civil Society Forum. And so those three together, I'm able to share my research. And doing that twice a year with a room full of people adds to the importance of the data that I collect, and to really bring those issues to the forefront. And just so you know, for the past 4 years, maybe 5 years, I've been able to bring up the very issues using my research data to the World Bank president. So sometimes the president is actually there in those forums. And he may never read a journal where I've published something, but if I can use my voice and share my data face to face at events, it increases the awareness of these issues.
Do you have any specific examples when, your research or other research led to meaningful changes in the field?
Sure. At the last World Bank meetings, actually the past 2 years, but I'll just use this last year. I mean, it's really interesting. You can even go back on World Bank and you can look at the Civil Society Forum with the World Bank president, and you see, oh, there she is asking the question and using her data. So, yeah, the new World Bank president, AJ Banga, took my question. It was the first question of the afternoon. And I asked him specifically about slums, and I told him about some of my data. And he welcomed me to come back on another day and talk with his team about those issues. And so that did lead, hopefully, to a fruitful outcome. We're still working on it. But I have been to the bank twice since those annual meetings. I did meet with a country team here in DC. I met with another country team that is in Nairobi. We talked about some of the issues, we talked about some of the data, and now we wait to see how they will integrate it into their programs. So research does matter. Data is super important, but you have to do more than just publish.
It makes a lot of sense. And your work also highlights how climate change, floods, droughts, extreme heat, disproportionately impacts slum dwellers. Do you have seen or do you have implemented any data collection best practices or methodologies that allows you to capture, um, these complex um, environmental and social challenges in the field?
Yes, there's a couple of research projects that I have completed, and one of them is written up and under review for World Perspectives, and the other one I'm currently writing up. One has more to do with climate impacts in slums from three different perspectives. So my research involved interviewing and taking surveys from people in government, from residents of slums, and from people who were involved with environment mitigation and sort of climate smart housing solutions. So the environmental groups, the residents, and the government. And it was really interesting because the set of questions were really asking for, who's responsible and how do we mitigate climate disasters, going forward for residents of informal settlements. So that was one project, and the data is really, really interesting. Hopefully, that publication will come out, fingers crossed, in the next month or so. And then the other research project that I am currently writing up had to do with how climate disasters affect women. We don't always think about how things affect women differently than men. We forget often about the roles that men and women play. And not to say that men can't do what women do and vice versa. But women, when it comes to disaster, they are typically leaned upon to make things all better. They're the ones who have to find a way to feed a family or to feed a neighborhood when something like a flood has occurred. And so the second body of research was conducted right after the Nairobi floods of 2024 that occurred during the month of April leading up to the start of May.
And how do you handle data collection in those cases? What kind of practices, what kind of methodologies do you use to capture what you need?
So, for example, with the women's research project and the floods, I didn't know that there would be a flood, right? I had no idea. And so, as researchers, we put together our perfect IRB applications with everything that we, think is going to be just perfectly aligned. And we get approved, and we carry that with us. We follow those IRB applications. But there are unexpected things that happen, such as the flood. I knew that it was raining in Nairobi, but I was not expecting a flood. By the time I landed, which was like March the 2nd, it was one day after almost all of Nairobi had flooded. Now, knowing that slums are typically along the side of rivers, the slums flooded much worse. And so here I am with my boots that I bought off the street because I wasn't expecting to be wading through water. Those are different parts of methodology that, I wasn't expecting. And to be able to safely navigate through, puddles of water, sometimes almost up to my calf, to get to the location where I was to conduct the research. Those are all different issues. Sometimes you have to turn around and you have to say, this can't be done, or I'm going to have to wait a week until the water recedes. And so sometimes we have to make those changes in our methodological plans. However, I was able to proceed, and the women who I was interviewing, they didn't care if the water was up to their hips. They were ready to proceed with the research. Different thing is that the questions I had lined up had nothing to do with flooding or disasters. And so these women were anxious to talk because they had a lot of emotions about what happened with the floods. So here we are with this predicament of, okay, this woman has a set of questions that have nothing to do with floods, and these women really want to talk about floods. And so the ethics of that have to do with following through with what's important for the human condition, right? Human subjects research is about humans. And so I went ahead, I followed the IRB. The questions that I had were fairly general questions like, what happens in your daily life? What hardships are you experiencing? So the questions were still relevant. It's just the answers were completely different than what I expected. And what I found is that I had to have the strength to hold the space when women would answer those questions about hardships. Some of them would cry. Some of them had to stop and compose themselves. Some women had lost their husbands in the flood by electrocution. People had children who were missing. They were playing by the river when the floods came and took their children away. So being prepared is really, really something as far as field research. You can't break. You have to hold the space, be kind, listen, slow down your pace, continue with your research. In other words, soldier on, but, be human about it and be strong enough to hold the space and continue.
That really resonates also with my experience in the field. I think it's really important to just be open, empathetic, and knowing that everyone is a human being. And a lot of the times we are in quite sensitive situations that we should be mindful and aware of. So you think this situation reveals some unexpected responsibilities that researchers might have, especially when they do field work.
Yeah, field work reminds me of a bit of journalism where, you're covering something, even if you're covering, something that you think is simple, and then something happens in front of you on the street. What do you do? You're a journalist, you're covering the issue. Do you talk about it or do you run away from it? And so, field research, some people are not prepared. They feel as if, oh, well, I'm going to ask these questions and I'm going to ask them, and it's going to be a lovely day. And then I'm going to go home and crunch my data, on SPSS. You have to be prepared for something different. You are in an environment where unexpected things can happen, and you should be prepared for that.
And something that I wanted to ask you about relates to this because you not only do research, but you are also a teacher. So you are overseeing a lot of students that might be going to the field for the first time. Um, and just like you mentioned, you need to be able to adapt, you need to be able to be ready in so many ways to handle these situations. How do you prepare these students?
Well, the first thing any of my students have, whether they are with me when I'm doing field research or whether I'm teaching in the classroom, they have to take the CITI training for human subjects research. Because I need for them to understand these basic principles. And it's wonderful because, there's tests at the end of every CITA module. And if you don't pass with 80%, you don't get a certificate. So I have all of my students to take the CITI training for human subjects research, and that's sort of our basis. From there, I also take a week, sometimes 2 weeks, to go over what an IRB application is like. So I show them some of my applications. I show them a blank application. We talk about aspects of the application and the phraseology and the wording that's needed to get past the IRB board. And then I also have my students to create a mock example of an IRB application for research that they want to do. And, we kind of do a peer review. We look at it and we say, oh, you should have said this, or oh, what about this and that? So they get trained in those basics very, very well. And then from there, sometimes we do sort of mock situations with interviews where if a student says, oh, well, I had wanted to do interviews on this subject, blah, 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 they'll put together maybe 2 or 3 questions, and I'll have the classroom pose as the interviewees. And I'll tell the classroom, hey, give her a hard time, right? So that when she asks these questions, there's a classroom of interviewees who are, either scratching their head or saying, I don't know what you mean, or, things like that, or distracted because they have a child in the room with them who's a pretend child. But we do these things so that the students are prepared and so they can think, maybe I should have had childcare as a part of my methodology so that parents would have a place for their children if they had to bring them, right? Or they realize, in this mock situation, maybe I should have had bottles of water because I didn't think about I'm going to be there in the summer. My interviewees may not have access to water. Maybe they just want, to cool off. So the mock and role play really helps students to be prepared as much as they can. And I will say that 2 summers ago, I had 2 undergraduate students who served as my research assistants in Nairobi, Kenya. We were interviewing people, and they were with me for 10 interviews. Each interview took about an hour and maybe an hour and 15 minutes. And the last interview I allowed them to do as a team together for support. But I allowed them to conduct that interview on their own. And they were so excited. So not only is the pre-training necessary, the mock situations necessary, but if it's possible, take an RA with you so they can see something, but give them a chance to do something. Let the students be involved. And so that's what I do, as a professor. I just kind of pull them along, drag them into it.
It is so important. Practicing is so important. And in terms of meeting IRB protocols, because it's something that you mention as a mandatory step when you are conducting research, have you ever faced an issue where IRB protocols conflicted with ethical realities in the field?
Yeah, that's a big topic for many of us that do field research in sort of fragile or semi-fragile areas, or just really in developing countries. And it's not just IRB protocol, but more so it's institutional protocol. The IRB is there to protect humans. I'm all for that, right? And the only thing that I find sometimes challenging with IRB protocol is the qualifications for that are required for local research assistants. So, in other words, if I choose not to interview someone because of positionality, and I want to use a local research assistant to pose those questions, sometimes there's pushback because it's like, well, how is that research assistant qualified? Have they taken CITI training? Well, no, they don't live in our country. They, of course, they haven't taken that training, right? And maybe the protocol for that particular country is different, right? And so I find that international research is widely pushed, like, yes, let's go find out. But then when you want to use a local research assistant, it's like, oh, they're not qualified enough. They can't do it. So I find that to be an issue. And so often when I do use local research assistants, I will go to the country in advance. I will go over the CITI training with them, et cetera, et cetera. And that's part of my IRB application, that I will review those things with them and maybe test them with, 5 or 6 questions about CITI training and ethics before we conduct the interview. But the biggest thing that I really would like to share, because I'm sure many of the listeners that conduct field research have experienced this, is the institutional protocol when it comes to payment of local vendors. When I say payment of local vendors, and you've probably experienced this, the local RAs may not have a bank account. The local drivers or people who may walk into an area with you to protect you, they don't always have bank accounts, especially when you're dealing with areas like informal settlements. People in informal settlements live informally, which means they don't have an address. If you don't have an address, you can't have a bank account, right? So there are issues like that where they do get on in society, but they get on in society economically using mobile pay apps, much like our Apple Pay. Kenya, in particular, has had quote unquote Apple Pay since 2010, way before us. And it was created for people who live in informal settlements who do not have bank accounts. They don't have access to those financial institutions. But in research, when I need to pay someone for their service, institutions are looking to wire money from the US institution to a vendor, such as an RA, and they don't have a bank account. And so it makes it very, very difficult. They don't want you to have petty cash. My institution, would not want me to have petty cash to pay them. So it's like, what do I do? How do I get help? How do I get the support I need to conduct this research? And so that's a real kink that needs solutions so that experts like myself can continue to gather valuable data, in a way that meets the needs of the institution and my vendors.
And following on that, I also wanted to touch base on something that reinforces how important is to involve local people, the local community, into these projects, is the language on your surveys, on your projects. And this is something that we talked about in a different episode about writing great survey questions. We mentioned how important language is. And usually, a problem is that questionnaires are designed usually by people that are far away from the context. And the language, the terminology, the tone, everything is so important to connect with people and, uh, and to have the answers that you are looking for. Does this resonate with you? Do you have any, stories or examples of how important this was for your research projects?
Yeah, when I first started conducting research in the slums, which was around 2010, I bombed out because I had these questions with these Western words in them. And those words were very confusing and meant nothing to the people who lived in the slums. And even though English is the first language in Nairobi, Kiswahili is a second language, believe it or not, it still didn't resonate. And so I quickly learned, okay, I've got to, you know, um, tweak my language differently in the questions. So, number one, the word informal settlement. That word pretty much means nothing to someone who lives in the slums. That's a word that we use in the West because we feel bad saying slum. Slum is a hard word. I get it, right? And so we have this word informal settlement. Yes, a slum has been formed, it's put together informally, and it is an informal settlement. But if you walk up to someone who lives in Mukuru and say, "Hello, I would like to tour around your informal settlement," they'll look at you and they'll be like, what were you talking about? I live in the slum. So, we have to kind of be careful when we're forming questions, when we're speaking to locals. Sometimes we think that something is a put down, right, for others. And so we want to be cautious about it. But sometimes emotions and our feelings don't resonate with the truth of the people. So the word slum is fine. People are very proud of the slum they live in. They'll say, I live in Kawangware, I live in Kibera, I live in this slum or in that slum. It's totally fine. So I had to fix that. And oddly enough, when I wrote my dissertation, every time I wrote slum, I had one professor who circled it and said, get that word out, get that word out, get that word out. And after a while, it was like, look, I want to, sure, this is part of my dissertation and I definitely want to get your approval. But I also want to be honest about how the people use this word. So that's one example. Another example is questions like, how many bedrooms are in your home? When you're dealing with extreme poverty, there's kind of no such thing as bedrooms. There's one space that's like 8 by 8 in size. That's it. There is no kitchen. There is no bedroom. It's a space. And so they don't call that space a home, they call it a dwelling, right? We are slum dwellers. It's a dwelling. And so if you ask someone something about, how many bedrooms are in your home, it does not compute. They don't know how to answer that. And you'll get incorrect data, right? You'll get the wrong kind of data. Words about boyfriends, they call them consensuals, right? So are you married? Are you widowed? Are you consensual? Consensual is the word that means I have a boyfriend. Employed. Are you employed? Seems very simple for us, right? Are you employed or not? They use the word gig, which means that you've got this part-time gig, and they use the word hustle, right? That's what they do every day. I hustle, right? And that means doing a variety of things. That could mean buying 5 tomatoes, and then trying to sell them for a higher price. It could mean taking scrap metal to a recycling center. It could mean washing clothes. It could mean bartering with another person where someone watches your kid and you do this, and the other time it's the other way. But gig and hustling are better words to use than employed because employment is not the thing. We talk about education. We talk about, oh, do you have kids in elementary school or do you have kids in high school? They don't use those terms. It's primary school, secondary school, tertiary school. So the linguistics, if you're not careful, you can get wrong data. And my recommendation is to talk to someone locally, let them see your questions, and have them to help tweak your questions so that they really, really embody the meaning that you want to come across in your questions.
It's a good recommendation. I was actually going to ask you how you would recommend people to refine their survey language and to test it. So reaching out to local people is the recommendation. What would be your top piece of advice for organizations or individuals that are looking to implement this type of community-led data collection research?
Yeah, civil society. Lean on civil society. You would be so surprised at how, when you connect with civil society in a certain area, the doors open for you. Anything you need. Civil society is so ready to help you as a researcher, and they have such knowledge that, you know, for me, people say I'm an expert. I'm like, no, civil society, they are experts. They are practical, they are knowledgeable, they are trusted. And trust is so, so huge with this. And they can get things done. And so, for example, a couple of examples. I wrote a piece about trust, political trust. I didn't conduct that research myself physically because I knew that my positionality was not one where the community would say, I'm going to tell her everything I want to tell her about the government. Mm-mm. That's got to be a local. And so I use civil society to go in and ask those questions about political trust because I knew that the locals would open up to them and not be afraid of any type of retribution. And so using civil society for things like that are super important. Also, for certain other issues that have to do with gender, even though I am a woman, I am an African American woman, and locals know, for example, that I have tampons easily, right? And they don't. And so they may feel embarrassed to talk about some of those issues that they have lack of sanitary products, that I might think poorly of them because of that, right? And so having a local using civil society again to go in and pose sensitive questions is really, really important. And so that's my best advice. It's so easy to connect with a civil society group because in any given city or town or country, you're likely going to find at least 4 or 5, if not more, groups. So if you strike out with one, try another one, build a relationship and pay them, right? We always think that, here's that IRB institutional thing where it's like, how do I pay you for this? They're offering you a service. They're doing something for you. They're helping you conduct research successfully. They should be paid. They should be, right? And so that's again one of those vendor issues where they've done the work. Without them, you would not be able to do anything. And they should be paid for it. And knowing that they will go over and beyond to help you succeed.
And to wrap up, do you have any resources that you would like to share with our listeners? People that are looking to do this type of research, resources, a book, an article, anything at all.
I don't have a specific book on it. There are several articles I can think of, but I don't think that they address some of the things that we've talked about, which, maybe that's an article I need to write, right? Specifically for the type of field research that I do. But I do, when I think about resources, I know you mentioned collecting data and how to make things how to get data to actually have an impact. I know we talked about World Bank meetings and IMF meetings, which are open to the public. You just have to apply to get a badge. But there are also ways that you can get that information to the UN. When you conduct research and you find it really, really important and you don't want it to just sit in a journal, it can be sent to think tanks. It can be sent to the UN. You'll have to do further research to find out who is best to receive your research. But once you do that, send it through. The UN has lots of ways for the public and researchers to feed them information. And I was lucky enough, let me tell you, really, really lucky enough to be able to speak on the UN floor about the issues of informal settlement dwellers based on my research. And it really, really was luck. I was not expected, I wasn't expecting them to call my name. I'm just sitting there thinking, oh, I'll just sit and, but yeah, for me, the resources are yourself. You are the biggest resource, right? Instead of reading something or trying to follow a certain set of guidelines, get out there, be a nerd and do the research just like I am, but then get out there and speak about it. The conferences that many of us go to, we share a lot of our information there. Take it higher, find other public places to get out there, and share. And as far as, different data collection companies, there are other resources. If you need lists, mailing lists for survey links, you can use different services for that, like Geopol. But also, again, if you work with civil society has local lists, really, really localized lists of people who live in certain areas. And when I say lists, I'm not talking about emails. I'm talking about mobile numbers. Most of the people who live in extreme poverty, they're not checking email, but they do have a phone. So civil society is also a great resource for getting your survey links out. Yeah, and then the last thing is sometimes you can partner with universities. I partner with the University of Nairobi. We've done some research with their master's degree students and my master's degree students, and sometimes professor to professor. I've also done some work with Kenyatta University and some think tanks as well in Nairobi. So the resource is you. Get out there, make those connections, and tell your story to the world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pashayan. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Survey and Beyond, the data collection podcast, is brought to you by Survey CTO. To find out more about Survey CTO and how it ensures reliable, secure, and scalable data collection, visit www.surveycto.com. And make sure to search for Survey and Beyond, the data collection podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Survey CTO, thanks for listening.